Terrorism has touched all continents and has affected the lives of millions of people all over the globe for centuries. The following is our presentation on a statistical study that covers terrorist attacks. With a dataset called Global Terrorism Database maintained by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, we made visualizations of different variables related to terrorist attacks of the last half century. This study attempts to find patterns and relationships between variables of various specific terrorist attacks. We found that the majority of attacks occurred in the past 20 years. The first peak was around 1992, with a big decrease from then onwards. This can be linked to, among other things, the end of the Cold War after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Terrorist activity began another big decrease in 2004 to 2008, then remained steady until 2011, and then experienced the biggest spike in recent years, reaching almost 60,000 attacks in 2015. We'd like to analyze what explains these ups and downs, variables that might have something interesting to tell us about terrorism.
The present maps and graphs represent the number of kills and attacks by country. We wanted to investigate if there was a relation between the amount of attacks and the amount of kills. Indeed, we can see that in general those countries which have little amount of attacks have as well a smaller number of kills, and the contrary, more attacks implicates more kills, as in the example of Iraq. Nevertheless, we found more interesting that we can see, mainly in the graph, that in those countries, most of them undeveloped and some in development process, Syria 1,949 attacks and 13,132 kills, Nigeria with 3,418 attacks and 20,665 kills, Algeria with 2,729 attacks and 11,091 kills, and Sri Lanka with 2,981 attacks and 15,528 kills, and finally Iraq with 22,130 attacks and 71,082 kills. This is that the amount of kills is in many cases almost 10 times the amount of attacks. On the other hand, we can see the example of the United States with similar amount of attacks and kills, or the example of Spain, in which the number of kills is a third of the amount of attacks, even though Spain suffered the era of ETA, or Germany with 703 attacks and 83 kills, about 1/10 of the amount of attacks. We believe this difference has its cause in the different ideologies, standing out terrorist beliefs like Islam in terrorist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, in where they target as much population as possible, whereas in ETA or other terrorist groups with different ideologies target specific individuals and not all the citizens.
We can see the Taliban and ISIS in the top two, with the Taliban having a whopping 6,571 attacks claimed. Ideologically, we can classify the top 15 between Islamists such as the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, or Boko Haram, left-wing nationalists such as IRA, the PKK, ETA, or the Tamil Tigers, and far-left militias, particularly from Latin America, such as Shining Path. Look at the change between decades. We can see that before 1990s, especially in the 1980s, left-wing terrorist attacks were the most common. We were at the height of the Cold War, and even though they might have been unrelated to the USSR, these militias were extremely active during these times. We can identify all the groups present are left-wing or nationalist terrorist organizations, with the exception of the Sikh extremist, which could be classified as a religious extremist organization. The 2000s, the 9/11 attacks, the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions, the creation of Boko Haram, the proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the Syrian civil war, to name a few events, have prompted an exponential increase in Islamic terrorism. We can see how between 1999 and 2017, Islamic terrorist organizations overtook left-wing and nationalist terrorism in number of attacks by a far margin. Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS have been the most active, particularly in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Syria. 80% of all deaths in 2001 from terrorism occurred in one of these 5 countries. The two following graphs represent the number of attacks by type and group between the periods of 1970 to 2000 and 2000 to 2017. The groups were divided in terms of ideology, red being left-wing extremist, yellow being nationalist extremist, regardless of their political orientation, and green being radical Islamists. It can be clearly seen that the type of perpetrator of the attacks have changed significantly. While in the first period, the main groups were left-wing, the more contemporary period has seen the takeover of radical Islamic groups. It is also clear that the type of attack has changed over time, with an increased focus on bombings and kidnappings, while targeted assassinations have almost disappeared in the 21st century.
Here we can see the current most frequent attacks per country. Bombings or explosions are the most common overall, and Iraq has the most number of attacks. But in the next slides, we will be showing the development of two time periods, the first from 1970 to 1999, and then from 2000 to 2016. So, from 1970 to 1999, bombings and explosions were more frequent, followed by armed assault and assassinations. However, armed assault had significantly more casualties at 77,000 compared to the 29,000 casualties from bombings or explosions. The most extreme attack during this time period happened in Gikoro, Rwanda, in 1994, which is also known as the Musha Church Massacre, which is part of the genocide, wherein 1,180 Tutsi civilians were killed. Next, in the time period of 2000 to 2016, bombings and explosions occur most frequently and are also the deadliest, with over 115,000 casualties only within 16 years. We can also see that 4 of the extreme attacks occur in Iraq, and we can also see that the top 2 are the 2 deadliest acts of terrorism. First, which happened in Iraq in 2014, which is the training camp massacre. Around 1,500 Iraqis were killed, and the most deadly attack of terrorism attack happened in New York City during 9/11, and these casualties only counted those who died from the hijacking of the plane.
As a finishing point, we will make a couple reflections on the rise of Islamic terrorism. Even though they use extreme interpretations of the Quran to justify the jihad and the imposition of Sharia law, we can't blame Islam fully for this rise. The opposition to US foreign policy has also contributed to this rise, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among many others. Chechen nationalism, the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Hindu-Muslim conflict in the Pakistan-India border. Overall, we cannot conflate Wahhabism or Salafism, which are the most extreme ideologies, to the rest of mainstream Islam. By doing this, we alienate the majority of Muslims that don't support these acts. Making the argument that Islam is incompatible with democracy suggests that the Wahhabi reading of Islam is in fact the correct one, and only furthers this narrative of conflict of civilizations.